Everyone in the U.S. has their own unique story of their family's history and how they came over to the United States. With my family, my ancestors came over at two very different times in our country's history, so I'm going to break it down into two different parts. To start, we follow back my paternal line all the way back to my 5th and 6th great grandfathers. My 6th great grandfather, James Gilmer, was born in 1728 in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, along with his son Robert, who was born in 1756. Because of the time period and the lack of records from the US and Ireland at the time, it is hard to say for certain when they came over with their wives from Ireland, but we know it was before 1803 because Robert's son James William was born in the US that year, but long enough after 1756 where Robert came over married. James and Robert were the first of my ancestors from my paternal line to come over to the United States. They started a very long lineage of ancestors in my family to live in the area of Abbeville and Anderson counties in South Carolina. In all of my research of my ancestors in the Gilmer line, it was difficult to find any records outside of censuses and deaths because of the area they lived in, which was a very rural farming area. Almost all of my ancestors in the area worked on their own farms or in textile mills for 5 generations. With that, one town that kept popping up as a central point was Honeypath, South Carolina. Honeypath today is a very small town with a total of 3,800 people in 2018. And having been there multiple times in my life, I've seen that even today I could find my family in the area. My grandparents were born there, and they were the first to leave the area in my family, and they only left because of my grandfather's job. My uncle was also born in the area and moved back to the area as an adult, living there currently with his kids who were born there as well. The second part of my story begins the same way as the first, with my ancestors coming to the United States. The difference is, instead of going back 8 generations, I'm only going back 2 on my maternal side. In the 1940s and 50s, with Europe still recovering from the end of World War II, many Europeans were immigrating to the United States, and that's exactly what my great-grandparents were doing. My great-grandparents were Voldemars and Amelia Porux. They were born and raised in Latvia and lived in Jelgava. At the close of World War II, the Baltic states, which are Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were annexed by the Soviet Union and occupied from 1939 to 1991. And with that, many people fled the region, and this is where the start of my great-grandparents' journey begins. Shortly after the Soviet occupation of the Baltics, my great-grandparents immigrated to Germany and lived in Rehburg, which is a town located in what was at the time British-occupied East Germany. My great-grandparents stayed in Germany up until 1950. In June of that year, my grandmother was born, and 3 months later in October, they left for the United States, came to Wyanett, Illinois, and settled 40 minutes north of there in Sterling. My great-grandfather, who was a teacher in Latvia, worked as a principal in the area, and my grandmother grew up there and met my grandpa at the steel mill. My mom grew up there her whole life, and today my grandparents still live in the same house that they've had for almost 50 years. I focused on these 2 parts of my family's history because I thought it was interesting that with almost 200 years between the 2 sides of my family coming to the United States, there are a lot of similarities between them, and I think if you look hard enough, you can find a lot of similarities with most stories of people coming over to the United States.